Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thanks for joining us today. Just in terms of housekeeping, if you have any questions along the way, please submit them in the Q&A box below, and we will respond to them at the end of the discussion if we have time. So the rules of work have changed. New legislation is rewriting the rules on everything from pay negotiations to job security. To help us make sense of it all, I'm joined by Michael O'Neill, a qualified employment lawyer and industrial relations expert who's worked for the likes of Qantas and Airservices Australia. Thanks for being here today, Michael.
Thanks, Bianca. It's lovely to be here.
So today we're going to discuss some of the key changes, what this means for organisations and what they can be taking into account when thinking about their IR position now and in the future. Can you provide us a brief background of how we got here and what this means for organisations and CPOs?
Yeah, thanks again, Bianca. Look, the discussion's pretty timely, coming just before the second anniversary of the first piece of industrial relations reform legislation, the Secure Jobs, Better Pay Act in 2022. This was followed reasonably quickly in the intervening 2 years by three more significant pieces of legislation: the Protecting Workers Entitlement Act, and then the first and second closing the Loopholes Act. Look, I think, and I'm not the first person to say this, that these are perhaps the most significant industrial relations reforms for more than a decade. The legislative process was grueling, and the four pieces of amending legislation comprising something like 760 pages of new regulation, on top of what was not an uncomplicated and small act to start with. And I think, as everyone on this call will recognise, the legislation does in fact substantially shift the balance of power in the industrial relationship towards employees and unions, and away from employers. I think now that we're, sort of 2 years in, as to be expected with such substantial change, most employers are yet to experience its full impact. It takes time for these things to trickle through.
Yep.
But what I think at a high level organisations should be doing, and if they haven't done this already, is start by conducting a risk assessment of what this new legislation will mean for them and their businesses. The changes are sweeping and they're broad, and they're going to have different impacts, or different parts of them will have different impacts on different businesses. Another theme that I think I'll add, although this is not new, is I would recommend a thorough audit of your payroll and time and attendance systems. It's not news that there's been an increasing focus on pay compliance and entitlement compliance. And there's substantial legal, reputational and cultural risks associated with failing to pay people correctly, even if this is a result of an innocent mistake.
Yeah.
And finally, in talk of broad terms, I'd think carefully about what the new industrial relations environment means for your broader business strategy and your broader people plan. I think the new environment will, for many businesses, have a much greater impact on these things than perhaps they have in the past, and that will continue into the future. I was recently speaking to a partner, one of the big four accounting firms, and she reflected how she continues to be surprised about how many large and sophisticated organisations still don't have well-developed and integrated IR strategies. It's something that just sits off to one side. The risks associated with that probably increase into the future.
So why do you think that is? Do you think it's because they're unaware, or what do you think?
No, I think it's been unnecessary for for lots of them. It simply hasn't been necessary. So those businesses where it is absolutely critical, those systems exist and are in place.
Yeah.
I think for lots of businesses, it has been able to be managed off to one side as a sort of periodic event, almost event management. And I think that that's changing.
With those fundamental shifts now.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. And like we will talk about kind of later on, it will be also around organisations where there hasn't been that much activity when will increase.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's one of the other impacts. So look, what can we expect? Well, again, and this is a theme, it will depend on your business. I think the first thing is that unions are back at the centre of the IR system if they ever left. So expect increased activity and organising. They've been given the tools to make this easier for them. I think that many employers will see increased union activity in their workplace. Now, that could look like a new presence where they've previously been absent. That could look like a more interventionist and active union where they've previously been present but perhaps largely inactive and compliant. Or it could mean, when you're already in a highly unionised environment, increased militancy and activism. I mean, union delegates now have the right to paid leave for delegate training. Employers now must provide reasonable facilities and time for them to communicate with and represent members. Now, many employers did this as a matter of good industrial practice anyway, but now it's a legal requirement. I think also, and this is a theme that we'll touch on as we move through this afternoon, that unions are central to many of the new jurisdictions and powers set out in the reforms. Perhaps, most obviously, the amendments to the enterprise bargaining processes, the new multi-employer bargaining regimes, or I think perhaps where they'll, that's the obvious place, but there are many out there, a myriad of others. So more unions.
Yeah.
But also enterprise bargaining will become more difficult. The number of unions through the multi-employer bargaining regime and just the ease of bargaining, or the fact that bargaining is now easier, the number of businesses required to participate in enterprise bargaining will likely increase. And there'll be increased union activity and presence. In bargaining, as with the rest of the legislation, the balance of power in bargaining has been significantly shifted away from employers and towards unions. Multi-employer bargaining is perhaps a case in point. That straight out amendment makes it much more cost effective for unions to bargain across multiple employers in the same industry, take protected industrial action against multiple employers in the same industry. And I think if anybody's really interested in the detail, there's a recent decision in the Peabody mining case that gives an early indication of how difficult it is for employers to resist multi-employer bargaining applications.
So that was something recently that's been...
Yeah, earlier this year.
Yeah.
So it's in the mining industry. So not employers who were unfamiliar with unions or unfamiliar with robust unions.
Yeah.
It's one of the early cases on how these provisions will operate.
Yeah.
If anybody's really interested, probably worth a read. It's easy to find on the Commission's website. I think another CBB, it's going to be harder for employers to resist bargaining. I mean, in the old regime, bargaining was initiated by the employer, and if it didn't agree to bargain, a union had to get a majority support determination. They were very, very difficult for unions to achieve in workplaces with low density.
Yeah.
And even when there were higher densities, they still put, some reasonable hurdles that unions had to jump through. Now all that's required is a letter.
Mm. Yeah, okay.
So people can get dragged in or required to bargain more easily, and the leverage in bargaining is reduced. Things like, previously only an employer could put an EA to vote, and it was virtually impossible for employees to force arbitration. Unions can now scuttle the approval of agreements more easily with the more genuinely agreed test. It's not simply a vote. And the new intractable bargaining regime provides a good option for employees, as any arbitrated outcomes must ensure they don't go backwards. A fabulous amendment by the Greens in the Senate at the last minute. And look, there are others. Time prohibits us from going through the whole legislation in detail, but
It's changed significantly.
the ability for an employer to threaten termination is now almost non-existent. Arbitration is still difficult. There's the new delegates' rights, new union rights of entries that I've mentioned. And the mitigation of protected industrial action is harder and more expensive with, less casuals and potentially more expensive contractor and labour hires. It's easy for employees to opt out with rights to disconnect.
So talking about that increase in labour cost and compliance costs, I guess the net effect of that is going to have different implications for different industry sectors.
Yes, I think it will, and I think that I and others expect that the net effect of these amendments will be increased labour costs, increased compliance costs, and probably reducing productivity. Businesses will need to rethink the engagement of labour hire and contractors, given the new same job, same pay, the availability of new same job, same pay orders. If you're a business in the road transport sector or you operate some form of digital platform, there's going to be new and pretty extensive minimum standards that you'll need to comply with. The use of fixed-term contractors is much more restricted, and a failure to pay attention to them could easily turn a fixed-term contractor into a permanent employee. And casuals, the restrictions on casuals have been increasing from some time, and that tends and that's ongoing. And as we continue to talk this afternoon, the management and mitigation of these additional risks will probably require additional investment. But one question, I suppose, and it might be a bit early, just some 2 years in, is has there been any impact on labour costs? And look, I think attributing economy-wide labour costs to a single cause is almost impossible because they're impacted by so many things like minimum wage decisions, employment level, inflation, etc. When I was thinking about whether there was any data that might shed some light on this, I thought one of the indicators that removes many of the variables was just to have a look at the average annualised wage increase in union facilitated enterprise agreement approved by the Fair Work Commission. This is material that's available on the Commission website. Look, the data is imperfect. It's as data always is, but a quick look at those outcomes show that the average wage outcomes increased from around 4% in July 2022 to around 6.5% by September 24. Although, as I said, the caveat is always that the data is imperfect. other equally imperfect measures, the wage price index sits a bit lower at 3.5% for the September quarter. But that in the context of the consumer price index sitting at only 2.8% in the September quarter. Innes Willox, the CEO of the Australian Industry Group, actually commented in August this year that labour productivity is now sitting at the same level as it was 5 years ago. So, look, I'm no economist. I'm a lawyer, so I don't really like numbers very much. They're very confusing. But I don't think you need to be one to recognise that labour costs and wages sitting significantly above CPI with productivity stagnant. They're not good news for employers. They're not good news for employees, and they're not good news for the economy as a whole.
What do you think some of the key drivers behind that? Do you have any idea?
Well, productivity's been a problem. Productivity is a bit like attributing wage costs, how, and everybody will point to different, I think our union friends would point to a lack of business investment and a lack of the use of technology. Employers would probably point to the difficulty in generating change. Obviously, COVID was didn't help productivity. So look, it's complicated. It's a complicated picture. You couldn't say it's this or it's this or it's that. But certainly it's fair to say that it is absolutely fair to say that, and we'll come to this, that driving through the industrial system, even in exchange for increased wages, driving improvements in productivity, improvements in flexibility will be increasingly difficult in the future. And they were never easy.
Before we go to our next question around what organisations can do, I've just had a few questions come up here in the Q&A. So I might just, while we're on the topic of the multi-employer bargaining provisions and thinking along that line. So I've had a question here from Trish, and obviously it's it's going to be varying, but in terms of, she's asked, what sectors do you think will be the most impacted by the multi-employer bargaining provisions? And I was also thinking this when we were having this conversation, because obviously you're going to have you're going to have organisations with quite a strong kind of IR workforce already, who are having their experts there, who are kind of have their EAs and stuff tied up and the rest. So do you think it's going to be organisations who historically haven't had the unions knocking at their doors, or do you think it's going to be organisations who have had that union presence ongoing, but now they're just bumping it up, or both, or what do you think?
Look, the provisions are very broad. And there aren't many cases. So at least on the face of the legislation, they could impact lots and lots of businesses. There were some fairly clear targets of that legislation. The mining companies, and in particular BHP, who use lots of contracts and lots of service providers to operate those mines, which are big and complex operations. And Minister Burke, as he then was and even before that, was quite explicit in that they were targeting the mining industry. There were some others. My old employer Qantas was named squarely as a target, and in fact, you've seen, in relation to the mining industries, there's the Peabody case that I just mentioned, which is in coal mining. My old employer Qantas was named as an explicit target, and we've seen there's already been some activity from the Transport Workers Union and the Flight Attendants Association in that business. The air conditioning industry, it went by consent, but they've engaged in multi-employer bargaining there. So look, at least based on the rationale for what constitutes the same industry in Peabody, it could be very, very broad. And I wouldn't necessarily assume that if you haven't had a union presence in the past, it would be an indicator that you won't necessarily be suddenly exposed to this the activity of this.
Changes. Yeah. Yeah, I think there'll be some low-hanging fruit there as well. There's another question here, which I think we're kind of going to touch on now when we talk about what organisations can do. So Adrian's put a question here asking, he's particularly interested in the discussion around how proactive and strategic approaches can help businesses adapt to these changes while fostering positive workplace cultures. So maybe I guess, that will kind of segue us into the next kind of topic around what organisations can do in terms of, I guess, yeah, from an IR strategy and from a people perspective as well.
I think, yeah, that's a great question, and it's a perfect. Although we know we won't segue to it immediately, but
Yep.
we will absolutely get that topic is front and center about how we counter some of this. So what can organisations do? Well, look, regrettably, there are no silver bullets. There's no panacea. There's no sweeping things. There's no one thing I can suggest today that says do this and everything will be all right. Wish there was. Be great personally, if nothing else. But look, the things that I would consider are firstly at a high level, the stuff we said, the things we talked about in our opening. Ensure that all of your IR risks, whatever they are properly considered and mitigations put in place where they're available. This is probably a new process because the risks have increased perhaps for businesses where they were almost non-existent in the past. And also, again, as we touched on, try and incorporate an IR approach as part of your business planning and people planning process, as we touched on in the beginning. Look, I would absolutely consider for a lot of businesses increasing the level of workplace relations expertise in the organisation. This is incredibly complex pieces of regulation, imposing various multi-factor tests that will need to be deciphered before compliance minimums can be understood. Is an employer casual? Is an employer contractor? Is an employee-like employee for road transport and digital platforms? Is the employee captured by the fixed-term contract regime? Is a refusal to respond to contact outside of employment reasonable? Should the FWC make a same job, same pay order? What's the exposure to the organisation of same job, same pay orders? Each of these have different and complex multi-factored tests, and each of them are rooted in the factual situation of the or grounded rather in the factual situation of how the business is organised and how its employment is organised. I mean, other points, who will manage the potentially increasing and more robust union presence in the workplace, increased rights of entry requests, more active delegates. Who and how will manage the enterprise bargaining, which will be more time consuming and more complex. And each of those things, in addition to the increased focus on compliance, remembering always that criminal liabilities for managing directors kicks off very shortly, and that's something to be aware of. A related point, largely grounded in the similar issues, is I'd absolutely consider what your budget for external legal advice is. Make sure you've got some good IR lawyers, if not engaged, then available. Much of the new regulation involves new Fair Work Commission jurisdictions to determine conditions and resolve disputes. There'll be lots more FWC applications, stop orders, rights to disconnect, same job, same pay, multi-employer bargaining, minimum standards for your employee-like employers, unfair services contracts terms, casual conversion rights. Employers and principals are going to need to defend these applications. You can't, it's very unwise just to wave them through, or we're effectively writing a blank check.
Yeah.
And really the breadth of the new powers is quite staggering.
And setting a precedent as well, I
Yeah.
think, yeah.
If we want perhaps a really timely indication of the likely increased workload, is the number of applications before the Fair Work Commission. In the Commission's recent 2023-2024 annual report, it disclosed that it had received almost 40,000 applications over that 12-month period. And that represented a 27% increase compared to the previous reporting increase, and was the highest rate of lodgement ever received by the Commission since the inception of the Fair Work Act in 2009-10. So, in short, be prepared to spend more time in the Commission.
And have those subject matter experts as well, either in your team or external services as well, because it's so time consuming as well.
Practically speaking, both are necessary. I mean, lawyers get very expensive when you use them for everything. So but you need to use them for some things, or may need to use them for some things. So yeah, there's that. And then, workplace relations expertise in the House, increased legal budget, and coming back to perhaps the in addition to an addendum to the broad themes that we're making earlier about risk assessments and mitigation, enterprise bargaining strategies to manage and mitigate enterprise bargaining are likely to be more difficult and costly than previously, but these are ultimately necessary. It's no longer going to be, as I think I foreshadowed earlier, wise to simply treat enterprise bargaining as an event that comes up once every 3 to 4 years, and you start planning for it 3 months, communicating with people about 3 months. 3 months out, hoping to close in about 6 to 9 months, is almost a complete rethink on the approach to bargaining. It almost becomes an ongoing process. Preparation for bargaining will, excuse me, I'll just have a drink. Well, preparation will have to commence earlier. It'll need to be much better thought out, supported by better business cases and positions, underpinned by substantial and detailed costing and other factual material. And coming back to the earlier question, look, it's always been my view that employee engagement of culture are critical, if an often unrecognised and underutilised tool in managing industrial relations, enterprise bargaining. That will become even more crucial. An effective culture and engagement strategy that attempts to align what employees see as their interests with the interests of employers will be vital in moderating claims, building trust, and limiting industrial action, and driving closure for practical and efficient enterprise agreements. I think we probably should be clear that's not going to stop robust bargaining. It's not going to prevent protected industrial action. But if there's a proper culture in the workplace, a good culture, a healthy culture, it will moderate the impacts of that. And this type of work is ongoing. It's completely, I mean, it sits inside a broader, obviously, culture engagement strategy, which sort of is the point I'm making about including this stuff in your people plan. But it doesn't start and finish with the commencement and cessation of bargaining.
of an IR strategy. And I think you've touched on this before. I think like the fundamentals, that trust and that communication, you need to have that to take everyone through it together so you can get the outcome that you're setting out to get. And if you don't have that communication, then you don't have that trust, then it will be a push and pull of employee versus employer.
Exactly. And I mean, it's difficult to pull it out in a sensible way to express it, because it is like a spider web. It's all interlinked. You know, that relates back to being able to substantiate in the negotiation room or in correspondence why a position is, with objective facts that bargaining representatives, unions, employees can read and believe and understand, so that, for example, when the business says, well, this is something we just can't agree to because it's going to have this impact, that's supportable. And there's a culture that says, okay, we believe you. We think you're telling, we think you're telling the truth. I mean, and communication is important. You know, it's a subset of that cultural piece. Your communications, you know, your internal stakeholders, yes. But in terms of reputational risk and approach you take, you're going to need to make sure there's an external communication strategy in place. Public, shareholders, the government, it's an increasingly fraught areas. Broadly speaking, when a business says something, the stakeholders, particularly the employees, need to believe it. I think, again, back to the planning, be very clear about bargaining objectives. What's the pain versus gain threshold? What can you live with? Where are the non-negotiables? What's your BATNA? And be really careful about concessions. Always remembering that an intractable bargaining application will not consider matters that have been agreed. So if a concession is made early, without an appropriate offset or counter concession locked in, it could be deemed to be agreed. So, you know, there's a very traditional bargaining tactic where you say, well, we can give you this if you give us that. Well, I don't want to say that's off the table as an approach anymore, but it's going to have to be very, very carefully managed. You're going to need to ensure that the board, executive, even shareholders and management are aligned with the bargaining approach. And look, finally, going to need a clear-eyed assessment of what the ability to withstand protected industrial action are and the tactics to be used to counter it, bearing in mind that some of the options traditionally open to employers, like threats of termination and things like that, are now effectively gone. The public is much more sensitive. Our union friends have got much more sophisticated over the last 5 or 10 years about managing public relations and managing public perceptions. Managing protected industrial action, and it will likely be more of it, is going to need to be, it'd be more carefully considered. And it's never easy. I understand. I've done enough of that to know it's never an easy option. But particularly if you link it with the intractable bargaining regime, if unions are resisting change, it's quite easy for them to inflict 9 months of relatively low-level industrial action that causes the employer intense pain, and at the end of it, they can't go backwards. So it gets more difficult. Look, so all in all, it's not a pretty picture.
It's a good question someone's asked around what positive, and not that there's positive but have you, and I guess it's kind of probably don't have the, it hasn't been in place for, I mean, it's been in place for a while now, but actually to get the data to see what's happening out there. Have you seen any type of positive impacts from this change, or what's, I guess, areas that are helping employers that weren't there before that they can leverage, or?
Look, there's certainly positives in it. I mean,
Mm,
people would argue that that wages have historically been pretty low. People's wages weren't moving. They are now moving. That can be a good or a bad thing depending on where your business sits. But
mm,
certainly, I think there's a view amongst some people out there that that's actually no bad thing, and that
mm,
I think there's evidence that supports it, that perhaps the allocation of profit has shifted unfairly in favour of capital, unfairly towards shareholders, and that Labor so that's a positive.
mm,
Not something we've covered today, but look, I think, you know, things like psychosocial safety and the positive duty, I do think that's a positive change. I mean, I
mm.
think there's an argument that work health and safety law always required an employer to provide a safe environment. It didn't say that was only physically safe. It always arguably included um,
Mental.
mental health. But
Yeah.
I think, look, that's a very positive thing. It's not something
Yeah.
we covered today because this is more industrial focused. So look, there are positives.
Mm,
I think Bianca, as you touched on, it is, and we commented on earlier, it is new.
yeah.
It is still settling in. So look, it may be that there are other positive outcomes that will merge, and there are probably some others that I may well not be aware of.
Yeah, and it is significant, and it will be interesting to see what happens. Got another question here from Matthew. So he's saying it's always insightful from you. Thanks, Michael. Does Michael have a view, given the federal opposition's expressed views on recent IR reforms, that many of the changes may be further reformed or wound back in the event of the coalition election victory next year?
Look, well, look, I suppose firstly that depends on whether there's a coalition victory next year, which you'd have to, like, yes, the opinion polls are sliding in their favour, but I think that's a bit. I think it was the Scullin government was the last one-term government in the 30s, and that got upended by the Great Depression. Look, the coalition doesn't have a great track record of amending industrial relations. I think they've very well learned the lessons of work choices, which wiped out the Howard Costello government and caused the sitting Prime Minister to lose his seat. The Fair Work Act was in place since, through many, many, many long years of coalition government, and no changes were made. I don't think we could be confident that a coalition government would make any substantial changes. They may tweak around the edges, I don't know. I can personally think of some that I won't share here, some relatively small tweaks that they could make that would restore a bit more balance without wholesale adjusting the thing. But I think the jury would be out. I think it would be risky to assume that a coalition government will substantially change this legislation. They may not be able to, depending on if the Greens have the balance of power in the Senate. Maybe even if they want to, they can't get it through.
Interesting.
We'll know at the end of May next year.
Just one other question that I have while we're talking through this, and obviously, given your you being a subject matter expert, employment lawyer, IR, and you've led teams and set IR strategy for a lot of well-known and highly unionised organisations, and thinking about some of the listeners here who may have HR teams in place. If you were, if you're in that position of overseeing like your HR team, so whether they're HR business partners, ER business partners, and IR, what would you, so in terms of these changes, and I'm sure you would have, not now, you would have done it previously when it was implemented, but what would be some of the low-hanging fruit that you would implement to get your team to where they needed to be? So obviously, the strategic piece, that would be what you'd be doing. But the day-to-day, to get it across the business, if you're sitting there, think about you're managing that team straight away, what would you be thinking that you would need to be doing with your HR team to get them to where you needed them to be, to mitigate the risk piece for your organisation?
Yeah, absolutely. So it does really come out of that risk assessment piece,
Yeah,
which you'd have to do first, and that will determine in effect what your low-hanging fruit
yeah,
is. So look, I think the first thing I would be doing, and again, it would also depend on, I think, whether the HR team, I know some HR, what would be regarded as HR business partners, HR practitioners, who are essentially also industrial relations, workplace
so I
relations
think, yeah, so
managers,
think about ER. Yeah, I think you've got your
they
ER
do
people, but
that work.
generalist.
They
Yeah,
do that. A generalist or often does that work, and
yeah,
they're often, in my experience, highly, highly capable and highly, highly skilled.
yeah,
Um, for those people, it's probably simply a case of identifying where the big risks are and making sure that they are understand what the risks are
yeah,
and help using their on the ground expertise to help formulate what the best mitigation
yeah.
strategies are. In terms of culture, where are the employees pain points?
At risk. Yeah,
Where's the risk sit? But also, this is what's coming at us, making sure they're just understand what the changes are.
yeah,
Lots of people do, but not everyone does. And it's perhaps particularly if you're less exposed to an industrial relations environment.
mm,
And then understanding what the impact might be and making sure they've got the support available.
yeah,
I think I think that approach is the same for those people who work in a less unionised environment. But I
mm,
think there's also perhaps some soft skills in that. How do you manage it? And some soft skills that perhaps most HR practitioners will have the skills, but
mm,
dealing with delegates, dealing with organisers, vague understanding of right of entry, some of those soft skills could be developed by some pretty simple training programs, providing
yeah,
there's the support in place,
yeah,
so that they know if they get a belligerent organiser, and some of them are, not all, but some. They know that there's support in place, because it's never fun to be faced with a belligerent organiser telling you what the law says,
mm,
and you just don't really know.
mm. And having that confidence of kind of working in that type of environment before
Yeah.
as well. Yeah, being on the back foot. Yeah. So just having that conversation with them, kind of making sure everyone's across that like the changes, what that could mean for their organisation, and then upskilling them where you can. And I guess that would go across to line managers as well, because a lot of those managers are involved in those EA negotiations and the rest, or they're not, but they're going to be soon once that bargaining picks up.
Yeah, that's right. It absolutely goes for line managers, and again, my comments around my HR colleagues. So I mean, I know some line managers who are credibly effective relationship managers, managers of unions, managers of their people, and there's a quantum of skills. There's a
Mm,
continuum of skill sets there. Yes, but making sure they're across it, they understand, they feel supported. And look, I've always had the view that line managers need to be involved in enterprise bargaining negotiations. I mean, enterprise bargaining is just a function. It's something that needs to be done where necessary in order to run a business. It's not an end in itself.
mm,
It drives towards labour costs. It drives toward productivity, which in the end drives towards the business outcome that line managers and executives
mm.
need. So they should absolutely be involved. I think I can't I can't tell a lineman. I can help bargain, I can help manage, but I can't tell you what rostering changes are
Yeah,
needed to run your business more efficiently.
yeah. It's so
Well, I
integral.
possibly can in airlines, but not elsewhere. Um,
They're so integral to the process,
it
that
is.
IP, yeah, and knowing
That
their team and
expertise.
their employees, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And they're their people.
yeah.
They're there,
Yep.
ultimately they're their people, which goes to that culture engagement piece.
It brings it back to what we spoke about around that trust and communication piece. Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure. If anyone has any last minute questions they want to ask, otherwise, I am going to thank you for your time today, Michael. And we'll have you back on. It'd be interesting to kind of have a conversation around this again. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what happens over the next few years, but also to have this discussion again kind of in 18 months' time. And yeah, kind of talk about some of the cases that have come up and what's happening in the space.
Yeah, look,
So
thanks so much for having me. And I think thanks to the people who dialed in for asking the questions, because it does make it much more a much more pleasant conversation if we're answering questions and people. But Bianca and Emma, thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Hopefully people have found it a little bit enlightening and a little useful. Yeah, it's been great to be here.
perfect. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks again for your time, Michael. And we'll see you next time.
Okay, take care, everybody. Have a good day.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.